There's nothing wrong with burning carbs. There's nothing wrong with burning fat. But it is very helpful for us to know what it feels like when we are utilizing one fuel over the other, especially if we are implementing carb cycling. Okay, carb cycling where we are sometimes running on fats, which has huge advantages, and sometimes running on carbs, which, believe it or not, also has tremendous advantages for particular use cases. So what we need to focus on is, well, what do we feel like in a given fuel burning state? And with that, we can time things differently, we can time our exercise differently, we can time our meals differently, but also just, it's kind of fun to know, hey, I'm burning fat right now, or hey, I think I'm burning carbs right now. So the first one is utilizing your brain and how your brain feels. Okay, a lot of times when you're using carbohydrates as a fuel source, you actually don't feel as clear. Now, not necessarily a bad thing because it comes with its own positive things. Like carbs can help our brain feel more calm and relaxed, which isn't always what we want when we're trying to actually think super clear. It's like right before you're falling asleep. It's not exactly when you want to be doing a bunch of mathematical equations, right? There was a study that was published in the British Journal of Nutrition. One of my favorite studies. It's so interesting. Took a look at 803 people, and they gave these people a regular soda, which is obviously rich in sugar, and they even gave them diet sodas, and they wanted to kind of see, okay, how would their brain respond? Well, they found that after having sugary beverages, the sugar, they found that there was a decrease in what is called spatial memory. They also had a decrease in working memory and a decrease in what's called executive function. Executive function, just like the name implies, is like the primary function that overrides a lot of stuff and controls a lot of things within our brain. The interesting thing is that the diet soda group did not see these effects. Now, that's not to say that diet sodas are what we want to be consuming, but it is showing that somehow the carbohydrates are negatively impacting our overall cognitive function. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're simply burning carbohydrates, you're running into this problem, but if you just ate a bunch of sugar, you would run into this problem. The other piece we have to look at ties in a little bit more with insulin resistance, so a little bit more longer term. So if you start finding that like maybe you're just having some levels of cognitive decline, it can come as a result of oxidative stress that comes from being insulin resistant. So if your insulin levels have been so high for so long, having so many carbohydrates for such a long period of time, then what ends up happening is eventually you sort of block the pathway that would prevent what's called cellular apoptosis. Apoptosis is the cellular sort of deconstruction or the cellular self-destruction that happens within the brain or in the body in general. So essentially, by being so carb heavy all the time, you can lose some cognitive function, but that might not be something you feel in the short term. Now, this one is interesting. It's surrounding the world of what's called orexin. Okay, orexin is a hormone that promotes wakefulness. So when orexin levels are high, we feel awake and we feel alive and we feel good. Well, what ends up happening is the neurons that promote orexin are actually inhibited by insulin. So when we consume carbohydrates and insulin levels go high, we inhibit the production or the release of orexin. Okay, what this is telling us is that we are stopping this wakefulness feeling. So it's pretty common to feel a little bit tired if you're running on carbs more so than fat. Now we look at the other side of the equation. If you're running on ketones or you're running on fats as a fuel source, you might feel a little bit different. Okay, it has to do with what is called network stability. Now there's a study that was published in the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, and it took a look at fMRI scans, and they gave subjects either a glucose bolus, a bunch of glucose, or exogenous ketones. They found that when they gave them a bunch of glucose, it destabilized network stability. Now, network stability is the ability for different regions of the brain to communicate clearly with one another. So when it destabilized network stability, the regions of the brain weren't able to communicate as well, thereby affecting cognitive performance. Whereas when ketones or fats were being used, it actually improved. So it's not to say one is better than the other, because we'll get into other things, but you might find as far as mental clarity is concerned, you're probably burning more fat when you're feeling super, super clear. The next one is hunger. Now again, it's not designed to be good, bad, or ugly, but what you might notice is that if you are utilizing carbs more, you might be hungry more. So there's a study that's published in the journal Obesity, and they use what is called a visual analog rating scale. Okay, and what they did is they gave subjects either simple carbohydrates or more complex carbohydrates. When they gave subjects simple carbohydrates, they found pretty clear as day that their ratings of hunger were significantly higher at 30, 60, 90, 180, and 240 minute markers. So they were just more consistently hungry when they had these higher carb, higher sugar, like simple sugar meals. Again, not really a surprise, right? But again, it's that insulin kind of blood sugar roller coaster. Whereas if you are having fats, a lot of times you're more satiated. So it's about what you ate in the short term, but it's also about what your body's used to burning. You talk to people that are doing a ketogenic diet or that are more fat adapted, they don't feel hungry very often. Let me say it's okay to feel hungry. Just because you are eating carbohydrates and you feel hungry doesn't mean that it's bad, but it's a good indicator like, oh, my body is burning through glucose and I am falling victim to this blood sugar roller coaster. Whereas if you're more used to utilizing fats, that blood sugar roller coaster isn't as much of an issue, so the hunger doesn't play in via that spectrum as much. Again, it's not bad, it's just the way that it is. It's a good indicator for you. Now, there was a study that was published in Obesity Reviews, and this was a larger meta-analysis in 2015 that took a look at ketones and overall hunger, satiety. They found that generally, when looking at multiple studies, if you are producing ketones, you generally have lower levels of ghrelin. You are usually more satiated. And then there's one particular study that looked a little bit more in depth. This was published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition. It put subjects on an 8-week ketogenic diet. After the 8-week ketogenic diet, put them on a 2-week refeed carbohydrate diet. Okay, it found that during the ketonic phase, when they were ketotic, they ended up having lower levels of ghrelin. Okay, they lost significant amounts of weight during the ketogenic phase as well. Then when they transitioned them back into carbs, things kind of changed a little bit, but what they did notice is that overall, people that were on the ketogenic diet, when they went on that, they ended up having these overall levels of ghrelin that were lower, and they had higher levels of what's called cholecystokinin, CCK. CCK is a hormone that sort of is a response to digesting food. When we eat food, CCK elevates to communicate with the brain that we don't need more food. When we lose weight, usually CCK goes down. In this case, with the ketogenic diet, even when they lost weight, CCK levels remained relatively stable. So what this is telling us is that if you are utilizing fats more, you're usually more satiated. Moving into this next one, this is very interesting, is how you respond under even light exercise, but exercise in general, okay? So what I will say as a positive, a lot of times if you are more of a glucose burner, you will probably find you have more brute quick strength, okay? You have the ability to sprint really fast for a short amount of times. You have ability to maybe lift weights a little bit heavier, right? That is simply because you have more glucose available for what's called anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic glycolysis is utilizing carbohydrates for fuel, and it is what we use for short, quick bursts, okay? But on the contrary, what you might find is if you were a carb burner, you might find that when you start exercising for a longer period of time, you bonk faster than if you were using fats as a fuel. Again, it's not a bad thing. It's like you're just burning it faster and hotter versus like more extended. See, with fats, we have lots of body fat on our body. Even if you're relatively lean, you have quite a bit of fat to be able to use. Okay, fats contain 9 calories per gram. So you just get a lot more energy density per unit of energy. Whereas with carbohydrates, you only have 4 calories per gram. So you have this muscle glycogen store that your body burns through, or you have your fat stores that your body can burn through. And if your body is accustomed to using fats, then you have a heck of a lot more energy. So you're not going to be at the mercy of how much muscle glycogen you have on hand as far as performance is concerned. Because if you have plenty of fat on hand, the muscle glycogen is to a certain degree somewhat irrelevant. It also simply has to do with oxygenation, okay? With aerobic activity, you're combining oxygen essentially with fat to ultimately create energy. So at a lower intensity, you might just simply find that if you are fat adapted and using more fats as a fuel source, you're going to be better at more like longer distance endurance type work. And if you're more of a carb burner, you might be doing better at your more anaerobic work. This is exactly why it's really good to know when you are burning what. Because you can time things. If you know you're more of a fat burner at a given point in time during your carb cycling, then go do your endurance work and optimize for that and burn more fat. If you know that you're burning more carbohydrates at a specific time, optimize for that and go do something that's more strength related. This is where something that's really cool comes in hand. You've maybe heard of some, oh, birds are excited about it. This is where something really, really cool comes in handy. It's called Lumen. Okay, and I definitely recommend if you are carb cycling or if you're trying to determine whether you're using fats or carbs, that you check them out. It's not like a breath ketone meter. It's different than that because what Lumen does is it measures the CO2, okay, the carbon dioxide in your breath. You may not realize this, but when you exhale, when you exercise, or just in general, you're burning fat through your exhalation. You're exhaling CO2, those carbons, okay? And those carbons that are in CO2 are usually pulled directly from, guess what? The carbon chains that make up fats. So when we exhale, we're exhaling CO2. The more that we're exercising, the more that we are moving, the heavier that we are breathing, we're generally burning more fat, contrary to what people say. It's pretty simple with that. But it's nice to be able to see, say, even at rest, breathe into this Lumen device and see, oh, am I burning more carbs right now, or am I burning more fat right now? It's the world's first actual metabolic tracker. It is super, super cool. SFSU actually validated their technology in terms of measuring CO2 and being an effective sort of metabolic tracker. So if you're trying to get more metabolically flexible, it's something that's really cool. The way that I like to use it specifically is kind of with exercise and meal timing. Like if I breathe into my Lumen device and I see that I'm registering more carbohydrates and that I'm burning more carbs, that might not be a good time for me to add more carbohydrates into the mix, for example. I'm already burning carbs. The last thing I need to do is add more in. I'm trying to get metabolically flexible. But if I'm burning more fats and I feel like, oh, you know what, it's a good time, I can get away with having some carbohydrates without really causing a big problem, then that's great. Or if I see that I'm registering more fats at a given point in time, and I say, yeah, I want to really lean into this and burn more fat, then I can maybe go fast and not eat for a while and try to really like tap into that. Or vice versa. Maybe I'm registering carbs and I don't want to be registering that I'm burning carbs. And I say, okay, it's time for me to fast and get myself out of this state. It's nice because it's not just measuring my ketones, it's measuring my CO2. So it really just tells me, hey, you're burning more carbs, you're burning more fat. Plus it has nutrition planning that goes along with it, so you can kind of use it to, boost specific timing for yourself and kind of learn a little bit more about your body. But I also just like to use it when it comes down to exercise, learning like, hey, maybe that run that I thought was burning a bunch of fat wasn't burning as much fat as I thought. Or maybe that workout was too intense and I actually tapped into more carbohydrate stores versus just cruising through my fat stores. So check out Lumen. I put a link down below. You won't be disappointed. Seriously, like I talk about various things. I don't talk about a lot of devices on this channel a lot, but this is one that makes the mark just because I'm a big fan of it. Guys like Dr. Mark Hyman are big fans of it. It's really got a nice advisory board of people that I really trust and admire within the industry as well. So that link is down below in the description to check out Lumen. This next one is sort of a good or bad thing when it comes down to carbohydrates. A lot of times if you're burning more carbohydrates, you might feel a little bit more relaxed, but you might even feel kind of sleepy. Okay, so if you feel like maybe your energy levels are just lower throughout the day, could simply be the fact that you're utilizing more carbohydrates. And it comes down to a very simple thing. Okay, a lot of times it has to do with what's called tryptophan, which we think of as sort of the like Thanksgiving turkey sort of thing, but it's not that. Tryptophan is what is called an amino acid, a large neutral amino acid. And what happens is tryptophan is generally competing with other amino acids in our bloodstream to ultimately get into the brain. If tryptophan gets into the brain, which we want it to, it helps produce serotonin, which can also help produce melatonin. So it helps us feel good, helps us relax, sometimes even helps us fall asleep. Okay? The problem is, if we don't consume carbohydrates, we have low levels of insulin. When we have low levels of insulin, that means that tryptophan isn't able to get into the brain as well because insulin actually opens the cellular doorway. Okay? So when we eat carbohydrates, that tryptophan can get into the brain better, which means we can be relaxed, serotonin levels increase, and we end up feeling like we can actually fall asleep easier. It's why even when people are doing a lower carb ketogenic diet, I still suggest sometimes having carbs at night. A few carbs at night can actually help produce or allow that tryptophan to get into the brain to produce serotonin, make you calm, make you relaxed. But if it's happening too much, you don't necessarily want to feel calm and relaxed right before you're, going into, I don't know, some kind of aggressive situation where you need to be amped up and you need to, like, I wouldn't want to be sleepy and relaxed right before filming a video. I like to be kind of amped up and ready to go. So it's something to be paying attention to. Now, the same thing applies not just for sleepiness and relaxation, but also fatigue when you take it to the extreme. There's a study that was published in the journal Obesity that took a look at a 2-day protocol. They took a look at guys and they gave them 2 days of either simple or complex carbohydrates. And then they used various rating scales to determine their mood score. Okay, they found that, of course, a simple carbohydrate breakfast skyrocketed glucose. No real surprise, but they found a direct correlation with that skyrocketing of glucose and their mood. They claim to be more fatigued and also more angry. So if you find yourself being irritable a lot, It may be interesting because the carbohydrates can, in one hand, make you feel relaxed and calm, but on the other hand, that can be kind of short-lived and you can start feeling kind of angry and not so good afterwards. So it's something to be paying close attention to. Now, the next one that I want to talk about is going to be longer term. It's kind of a bonus one. If you find that you are thirsty a lot and you're peeing a lot, it may be time to start thinking about occasionally going lower carb and carb cycling. This is more of a warning sign of when it's time to, okay? Because these are signs of becoming more insulin resistant, okay? This is a big problem because what ends up happening is because if glucose levels are so high in your blood all the time, what ends up happening ends up drawing more fluid into that tissue, or into the bloodstream, and then your kidneys process it, excrete it, and you urinate it out, and you're actually very dehydrated, so you end up constantly thirsty, or you're peeing a lot. So you're thirsty because you're peeing a lot, and you're peeing a lot simply because you're losing water. So they go hand in hand. So if you find that that's happening even when you're eating carbohydrates, this is a serious thing, especially if you're not drinking a lot of water. So it's a good warning that, hey, my body is had so many carbs over a period of time that it's becoming a little bit more resistant to utilizing them. Now let's touch on some benefits of carb cycling here for just a little bit, because people watch my channel and they think that it might be one-sided towards being a lower carb approach. No, this channel is much more about performance optimization, overall cognitive optimization. And carbohydrates have a huge effect on our body, right? They can obviously are a primary fuel source, but when we learn to tap into fats, it's like we're gaining an additional. So the idea behind carb cycling and burning both is that you get the best of both worlds. Carbohydrates when it's time for exercise, when it's time for more intense activity, fats when it's time for more endurance and more cognitive function. And also simply being able to give the cells a break now and then, because if they're constantly bombarded with glucose, you run the risk of becoming insulin resistant. If they're constantly bombarded with glucose, you run the risk of not being able to tap into your fat stores as well. And on the contrary, if you're always in ketosis or you're always low carb, you run the risk of becoming glucose intolerant because your cells sort of, use it or lose it fashion, forget how to run on the carbohydrates. So being able to vacillate back and forth between letting the cells use fats and also letting the cells use carbs is true metabolic flexibility, okay, metabolic switching. It's becoming somewhat more of a clinical term. We're hearing it in research groups. They're hearing them actually talk about this metabolic switching effect. That truly is the best of both worlds. Fat sometimes, carbs sometimes, which is why I think it's important to know when you are burning each one. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. Don't forget to check out Lumen down below, and I'll see you tomorrow.